Hello to Mindfulness Collective. This right here, right now, is the joy of being a live stream coming to you live from Brooklyn, New York over here. And if you're joining us anywhere other than twitch.tv/deepmindfulness, then please come on over. That is where the party is happening. Looks like we have a little cord conflict here. So folks, where are you coming from? Always important question. Where are folks joining us from? Ah, yes, much better. Where on earth are you? Where does this day find you? As I rearrange the entire studio. Lovely. Okay, folks. Lovely, lovely. Welcome, welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. As always, it is such a delight to have you here. We have Ralph popping in from Brooklyn. Welcome here, sir. Nice to have you. It's good to have you at the retreat yesterday. One of the sort of interesting things about having a large retreat is that you don't get to talk to everybody, and you're at one of the examples, you were in one of the other rooms. I have frozen. If you're new to the stream or haven't been here in a while, this is our latest technical challenge, which, trust me, if you're an old-time stream participant, this is the least of your concerns. This occasional light freezing, very minor. So folks, where are you coming from? So far, Brooklyn is entirely dominating the court. Oh, we got Lewis. Oh man, this is like an old school reunion here. Lewis here from Yorkshire. Lovely, good to have you here. Stream is a bit laggy, so let me, if anyone else is having that same issue, let us know, but I'm pretty sure it's those kind of things we don't have a ton of control over. What was funny is the camera was crooked for the retreat yesterday, just slightly. It was just like slightly crooked, and I kept finding when I'd look in the monitor, I would like lean over. I'd be like, okay, I'm going to sit like this. This is funny, so I tried to straighten it today. I think it's actually a little crooked the other way. I think I'm leaning the other way. No, my puppy's whining. Let's try if we can, straighten that out without freaking out. Yeah, let's see about that. Maybe that looks upright. My poor puppy is whining. Well, she's probably whining because we're not meditating yet, and she's desperate to get into that practice. What's up? Okay, awesome. We got Rory from Kingston. Welcome back, Rory. Rory's a long time. You're on quite a streak, Rory. You've been here for some time, so we really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Yeah, folks, what is up? What's up in the house? I got a different green drink today. Every time I see this, it looks terrifying. It's like, what the hell is that? It really looks like, I feel almost bad showing you, but it just looks like some kind of sea sludge here. What do we got there? Aiming as it pours out onto my microphone, right? Just sea sludge. This is my breakfast every day. You might wonder, why are you eating breakfast at 11 a.m.? Well, let me tell you. Sometimes I like to stretch it out. Yeah, so where are folks coming from? I see there's a number of folks here with us. Love to hear where on earth you are. It's nice for me because while I don't have exact geographical locales, pinned in my brain, there is a sense of sort of spacious, my imaginary sense of where Gothenburg, Sweden, where Nick is, where Brooklyn is. I think I know where Brooklyn is. That's where I am. Where, Kingston, Ontario is. There's this sort of spatial sense of a globe and people upon it. And I get to participate in that particular global spot. So, okay, let's do a little bit of a touch up here on the cam stream. Okay, folks, so we're going to be meditating today. Today is going to be a freestyle meditation, which is fun for me because often you may not know this, but as a teacher, you don't necessarily pick your own what meditation you do. But what's interesting, I find, is that I get what I need. If somebody says I want to do loving kindness, or somebody says I want to do X, Y, or Z, I typically feel like I get the thing that I need. So what I'm going to say is there anything coming up in your practice And what is that? Any questions that you have about practice, about life? It's often helpful for me to have some kind of grounding. And I think this is a challenge that students come to as well. If you have every possible option in the world, well, what the hell do you do? That's often where, that's often where we can talk to each other and say, okay, I'm working on this, or talk to a guide in that way. And so for me, what I like to do is ask you, what on earth is happening in your practice? Maybe some people came to the retreat yesterday and are highly curious about what the hell that was about. The replay for the retreat, by the way, is going to be popping off not terribly long. We'll be getting that together, but there's some editing that needs to happen, and I wanted to apologize because we had a slideshow as part of the really essential part of the guided meditation, and for a number of people, depending on the type of system you have, it showed up very tiny, which was the exact opposite intention. So we could even go over that slideshow today if people wanted to, if that sounds like that would be fun. But folks who went to the retreat, let me know, because we already did that. But we sort of did it because it had a little glitch, whatever. Excellent, folks. Excellent. Okay. So, what is up today? Folks, find a nice, comfortable position that you can maintain for the duration of the sit. We're going to be meditating for about 25 minutes. Oops, I should probably cage the beast. She's getting pretty rambunctious. I think people probably want to see her. That's my guess. Usually people are happy when she comes back. She comes around. Okay, you're only going to be here for a minute, so don't freak out. Okay. This is Sila. If you haven't met her or seen her in a while, she's really big. She's a big old giant. Look, that's our people. Look. You don't know how to follow my finger. Yeah. Aww, little sweetie. Hello. She's a sweetie. Aww. Okay, you're going to go into your little doggy prison, and then you can come out after. Okay. Here we go. Ready? Help me up. Okay, so we have one vote for doing the slideshow again. Let's plug into it after. Let's do a kind of standard run-of-the-mill old meditation. It might be a fun thing to do after, or maybe we should do the whole thing right now. Yeah, what the heck, let's do it now as a standalone. Okay, it's going to take me a second to set up here. Give me a second here. We'll do this as the guided meditation. So it's going to be some visual meditation, just so folks know. And this is going to require me to move windows around and this kind of thing. Okay, monitor 2 is on. Okay, so I'm going to replace my entire monitor with this thing, and we'll do the meditation from there. Bigger, please. Okay, excellent. So folks, finding that nice comfortable position that you can maintain for the duration of the sit. Now what's interesting here, so we'll just, sorry, there's going to be some banging. It's work time for the locals. Work time for the locals. Okay. So the following guided meditation is based on the material that happened during our most recent retreat. And there was a large conversation related to the mind's tendency to produce meaning. So what we're going to be observing is how the mind reacts to various stimuli. And I want you to observe what happens on the screen. Notice, without trying to interfere in any way, what the mind does, what the body does in terms of emotional response, this kind of thing, and how that changes. If you were a participant in the retreat yesterday, it's likely that there's some trace of a narrative of this guided meditation that I gave yesterday. It's also likely that there's a trace of the narrative of what actually occurred for you during the retreat. And the same way that there's a trace of the narrative or the history or the karma or the momentum of all of the previous moments from your entire life. You can, if you have a sense that you've had a life, right, that's the expression of this material as it comes forward. And being able to watch that material form is one way, and I find it to be quite a significant way, of breaking through that material. So breaking through the prison of the need to be within a narrative, to be within the self, to have this kind of combat between self and world, group, us versus them, all of these different pieces are significantly challenged if we can actually observe the formation of these tendencies towards narrative. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is, if you can, full screen this video. And that will give you the best chance to sort of have the overall effect that we're going for. Okay, so beginning by finding a nice comfortable position that you can maintain for the duration of the sit. So we'll be doing an eyes open practice today. So I'm going to ask you to find a single point to rest the eyes on that is not text and is not the screen. Taking a few comfortable deep breaths and just feeling the body rise and fall. So we'll be exploring the mind's tendency to produce narrative. And the mind does this on several layers. There's the large narrative of the self. This is the primary complex narrative that we interact with in our lives. The sense that we are the main character of an ongoing drama. So noticing that if there is any sense of self arising, any sense of my future or my past, again, not guiding the mind, just noticing that these kind of things will arise. There's also the layer of narrative, of mind organization related to space, the environment that we're in. The fact that the mind will tell us over and over again that there's this consistent XYZ axis, the spatial stage that we tend to imagine that reality is playing out on, with, of course, ourselves being spatially at the center of this stage. There's the narrative of preference. The mind organizing data as something we want, don't want, or don't care about. This is commonly referred to as clinging and aversion, or unconsciousness. And of course, there's the narrative function par excellence, the production and the experience of time. The sense that this moment is marching forward. That this moment is part of a progression, that a future will occur experientially, and a past is gone, and we have no access to it experientially. So as we move into the following process, simply noticing these different forms of narrative, of data organization that the mind will tend towards. So go ahead and bring your attention to the screen. Go ahead and explore the visual activity. The different dark and light shapes and contours. The movement of line. And the mind may produce a narrative in the form of, for instance, seeing faces where there aren't any intended. Notice that once the mind sees something it thinks is there, as though we're looking for animals in the clouds, it's very hard to unsee that. The mind has gripped. So we just want to observe that process occurring. It's not good or bad. It's a natural clinging process which occurs in the mind and body. It's natural. It's not something to be gotten rid of. The mind may produce a narrative about how this image was formed. What set of circumstances, materials, came together in order for us to see what we're seeing now? Perhaps a narrative about someone who did something to produce this. Again, notice that each of these different pieces has a narrative connection to us, to the self. And notice that the areas with just lines and shapes, these are more abstract. In this way, they ask less. They're not asking us to maintain a narrative, a story. There's a less layered relationship, less of a space for a self to reside. So the narrative side is not bad, and the abstract or the deconstructive experience is not better. This can be a tendency of the mind as well. Noticing that narrative, if there's a preference towards the deconstructive or preference towards the non-narrative, perhaps the non-self side of the spectrum, we don't want to reject even that narrative, just noticing that the mind may or may not be doing this to a lesser or greater degree. This is our doorway. Watching the mind form, organize data, because it can't organize all of the data all of the time. So watching it form is our doorway to seeing through, recognizing it as just another shaping, just another carving of nature, like water on a stone. The mind taking all these elegant shapes of self and time and world, mine, stories. And so with this relatively abstract image, observe what occurs when the image changes, watching how quickly the mind will wrap itself around the new data. So this is the same set of material, simply zoomed out. Immediately the mind pulls this shape together. This is the mind arranging things spatially. This seems quite natural to us, but many animals, for instance, can't see two-dimensional objects as three-dimensional, so we don't have any sense of space in a two-dimensional object. So the mind producing space here, a sense of foreground and background, volume, density, recognizing this organization as occurring. It is a phenomena that is occurring as the mind organizes almost instantaneously this set of seemingly random lines. Into a narrative of shape and space. And noticing that if we hold this information in specific ways, it can change this sense of narrative. For instance, if we look only at the darkest lines, these can push forward and break apart the sense of space. They can look abstract, deconstructed. If we zoom into any particular piece, visually, mentally, and absorbing ourselves, allowing the rest to fall away, we'll notice that the narrative of space, in this case, also breaks down, just for a moment. So going ahead, zooming in deeply to just one little area, being absorbed in that area and noticing that it's hard to observe this area very closely and maintain the same solid sense of space, of volume that occurs when we allow the eyes to move around freely. Once again, letting that go and letting the eyes move around, letting it produce narrative, and just watching that sense of space appear. And perhaps the mind tells us about how we identify with this image. We feel more or less closely aligned with what we imagine is occurring in this image. It is more or less alien to us. And watch what occurs. Watch the mind snap and change this narrative when the image changes. So getting a snapshot, getting a sense of what this experience is like now, and watching what occurs when it changes. Notice that the mind uses the narrative, the sense of space, as a ground on which to show us, to give context to these different parts. Notice that what is novel, what is new, often takes priority. The mind easily recognizes body parts, anatomy. Noticing that the parts that are more rendered, or rather more recognizable, hold a kind of weight.
In our native language.
They pull the mind, they organize the space, they show us what our relationship to it is. Again, this is the mind using its relative experience. We are familiar with a human hand. And so there's a degree to which it's easy to settle on and know the experience of a hand. And so once again, observing what occurs. We can look closely at the abstract, deconstructed detail, and yet the mind maintains this narrative, this space. Now these identities are beginning to unfold. We're beginning to get a sense of who these people are, perhaps how this image came to be. Again, not trying to produce this, just noticing that the mind does this on its own all the time. And noticing what happens when we introduce a different detail. Noticing the gravity that a human face has. We'll find faces, even in abstract, zoomed in, deconstructed experiences. The mind will try to produce these narratives. So when one is given, it has a strong pull. In fact, if we look at the face of this character, there can be a sense of a relationship internally to ourselves. Who are they looking at? In this case, it can appear that they're looking at me. So perhaps there's an emotional component, checking with the body. Identifying or feeling alienated from this being, this person. It is like or dislike us. And so taking a moment to explore this visual space, zooming in, noticing what occurs to the overall narrative, the weight of this face. The structure and solidity of the space. We may have experienced something like this before, watching the narrative of self and world break down. So the mind might tell us this is unimportant, or tell us to rely on the narrative we've already experienced. So being sure to observe it, not simply think about it. Observe what happens when we deeply enmesh ourselves in some detail. Fully engross ourselves in one particular line. And the difference of that, when we allow the narrative experience to return, the face, the environment, noticing that each will affect the other. Our moments of deconstruction will shape how we relate to the reconstructed experiences. Now one further change, and notice again the change. Take a snapshot of what this experience is. And as subtle as it may seem, noticing that for us in this moment the world has changed. The old order, the old narrative, is being replaced. That which the mind naturally used to create stability, the order that it created, is now being reshaped, replaced by a different order. Perhaps experiential narratives of class, of gender, of time and culture. These different narratives come in now. Allowing us to observe the contrast of our own experience. This contrast showing us whatever self, whatever history of our own experience is coming to meet this image. So how then, in our lives, in our practice, do we break down all of these narratives of who we are? Of inside and outside? How do we step out of these if we want to? And if we can't step out of them, are we really choosing our experience of narratives of self and world, or are they a kind of restraint? So there's two ways generally that we do this. One is what we've been doing so far, which is to zoom in. But notice, as the narrative becomes more complete, as there's more solidity, more human faces, spatially organized, it's harder to zoom in. There's more competing narrative. That's fine, because we have another option. So in this case, looking at this little dot in the middle, noticing all of this narrative that we've explored so far, the mind is trying to put it on this strange little dot. All of that data that we've experienced just moments ago, the lines, the contours, the faces, the transformation from one slide to the next. That narrative is within us now, and yet the mind wants to place it there. So in this case, we're zooming out. So observe the dot, observe all of the white space, but also observe the narrative as it exists within you now. The mental image, the emotion in the body, perhaps even any mental audio that went along with this process. One way to break apart narrative is to zoom out, to take in more data. And of course, the other option is to zoom in. And you may or may not be able to notice that we can actually do both of these simultaneously. We can look at this close detail, directing our attention to some specific node of visual activity. And we can also take in all of the visual activity around it, all seeing at this point. Or zoom out enough to include all sensing, using awareness to consume and hold this spot of deconstructive attention. Both of these have these effects of affecting and transforming narrative. And taking this moment before the practice ends to notice that these narratives exist within us. Their momentum is felt in the form of emotion, in the form of physical aches and pains in the body. In the form of memory, planning, fantasy, in the form of a sense of a self, of a world, of an inside and outside. In the form of preferring. Often we prefer or imagine that things would be better if we didn't have narrative, but we do. So the key is to recognize that all of these narratives are nature. Neither good nor bad, just the different shape of the same raw sense data, the Rupa, that makes up all of our experiences. And in this way, allowing this moment to be the great teacher. Letting this particular moment show us how we can bring this practice into every aspect of our life. Okay. That was fun. Fun for me. So making any adjustments you need to allow the body to be comfortable. what I think is most fun is that I get to do the same meditation over and over. You know, it's funny. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background here. So part of my background is that I have a 2 degrees in fine art. I was going to say a degree. 2 degrees in fine art. One in sculpture and one in painting, which at the time seemed radically different and now seems sort of hilariously similar. So my background is that I have, 2 degrees in fine art. And I used to think all the time I would make paintings, but I really, really admired jazz musicians, jam bands. And they could make the same work. I always thought about this. How is it that I could do something where I can make the same artwork, but have it be new, have it be different? And so each time it arrives at a place, I can make it in a different way, in this way that, a band can show up and someone can love this certain hit and they can make it new. They can make it something that hasn't been experienced before. Always wanted to figure out a way to do that. Because there was this thing of like, I thought about these bands that, don't improvise and sort of just play things straight, and how agonizing it must be to need to play the same song over and over and over again. And not only play it over and over again, because they don't really do a lot of improvising, people want to hear it exactly the same way. They don't want some, strange version. They don't want some like Lou Reed version of the song, that's entirely different. But that's what I was interested in. So the fun part for me is that I get to explore this material and have it be the same material. If you were at the retreat yesterday, hey, listen, we're going over the same exact material, technically, but it's quite a different experience, at least for me. So I would be curious from you, what was that like? We have another abstract edition here from Rostin C, PhD. I'm going to just read this outright with all the dyslexic mistakes because I think that's a little bit more fitting. Do you believe in apes? This is the theory of Carlos drawing the theory of apes. He says humans were created from monks. I don't believe it. Commas hurt. Commas. He's the Mexican evolutionary biologist. I created the theory of non-apes, and he agrees it may be true, which is good. Good to have agreement. It states apes are not actually a thing. Well, interesting you should say that. That there is this sort of argument. I have a friend who's in philosophy, and he's in linguistic philosophy, and I was more interested in sort of late continental philosophy, and like post-structuralism and deconstructivism. And I used to argue with him that tree does not exist, or rather, what we think of as a tree can't exist, and this to me is like this sort of obnoxious, like college arguing that that boys do or whatever. This is like the kind of arguing that I don't really like anymore. So this idea that the frozen camera, that what we think of as tree actually is not there. What we think of as ape is actually not there. That we can have a concept, and the concept certainly exists. The concept of, a tree, or a concept of an ape, yeah, sure, those exist. But the tree doesn't know that it's different from, it doesn't know that its roots are different from its leaves. It doesn't know that its leaves are different than sunlight. It has no way of telling the difference. And for us, we separate it out and we say, well, this is a sycamore and this is these kind of things. And these are all concepts. That's lovely. But there is a type of experiencing that doesn't require that linguistic narrative of objects. And so that's what we're leaning towards today. So funny you should mention it, that apes are not actually a thing, because there's a way in which that's entirely true. This is not to say that matter does not exist. I don't believe that personally. I know some people do. I've met 1 or 2 of them in my life, and the conversations get very silly very quickly. Is all space created in the mind? It depends. Rory asks, is all space created in the mind? Yes and no. I'll just leave it there and just leave you confused. No, so it depends how you define space. If you define space from a scientific perspective, no, that is not created in the mind. That is an actual, physical truth. However, scientific space, when we talk about like E equals MC square, or these actual, how physics experiences the world, is not how humans experience the world. We experience, I'm in a small car, or I'm in a big building, right? Or, well, this object is obviously quite small. I mean, this is clearly a small object, but the reason this object is experienced as small, and the mind tags that as being categorically, yeah, it's small. Of course, anyone would look at this and see this is small. Here's an example. So I have my dog, you've all seen, it's a small dog. And it runs around, and we always wonder, why do these little kids get so scared of this dog? They're like, oh, running away. It's so cute. You see these like 1-year-olds. I guess 1-year-olds aren't walking yet. So like, I guess 2-year-olds or 2 to 3-year-olds. And this, dog comes up, and she's really friendly. She wants to hang out, and she's never going to, bite. So we're like, why are they afraid? And they're really afraid. And we realize, oh, because the dog is freaking giant to this person. The dog is like, it's like the size of like one of those, not Doberman, one of those giant ones, the ones that, not Clifford, whatever, you understand what I'm talking, Great Dane, like these enormous dogs. And so it's big, but it's a small dog. How could you be bothered by a small dog? Ah, ha, ha. This is small because it's smaller than the body. And if you want to get actually really fancy, this is dull, right? Because it's not sharper than the body. Something is typically defined as sharp because it can cut you. So this is a very important and specific insight or set of concepts that were used in minimalism, which people often are like, oh, minimalism, there's just nothing to it. Oh, no. Minimalism is often quite brilliant because it's talking about relative space. It's talking about how space is created in the mind. So there's one, I was going to say famous. It's not famous. It's a sculpture that I like a lot. This one sculpture by an artist named Richard Serra, who's really, he's like kind of one of the most famous people to talking about this, but he has these two sort of cubes, you could say, but basically what he did was they formed cubes out of steel, and at a certain point in the cooling process pretty early on, they released the mold, and it just sort of melted in these different ways. And so they're sort of cubes, but they're a little weird and off, and they're different from each other. They're all unique. And he put these two cubes at the end of this long, you could say like walkway. I forget what it's called. It's like a French palisade or something. Long walkway. So the artwork is on both sides of this palisade. And so you look at the thing, you're like, okay, this is a cube. You walk over to the other one, you say, oh yeah, it's the same cube. And then there's sort of this mental gymnastics that happens. Well, it can't be the same cube because it doesn't look like it's just a cast or copy. So okay, well, how are these different? Are they, you look at one thing and you say, okay, the top of this is slanted like this, and the side, you go back, is this the same thing? It just turned a little bit. It's like, no, I think it's actually, you start to see, okay, there's these differences and these things, and then you go back to the other one. But just like the thing we observed today that was just a tiny little dot, you're talking about spatial relationships, this is what sculpture is. You're observing spatial relationships. How does something move when you move in space and time, and how does something change and interact through space? What we're looking at here is the person is comparing these two different things, but when you look at the actual artwork, it's just a dot. The spatial relationships are being carried in the mind from one place to another place. And that's how it's this sort of beautiful illustration that space is absolutely contained in the mind, the kind of space that we're talking about. You'll notice that a house doesn't need to be bigger, right? We just put a bunch of mirrors on the wall and suddenly it feels bigger. It's like we're so simple that we actually don't even need more space. We just need more mirrors, So yes, most space that we would refer to or understand as space for ourselves is defined and created in the mind. That's not to say that what we call space in the outer atmosphere is not physically there in that way. We're talking about perception. Bob likes the slideshow. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. I'm glad you liked it. It hid all of the frozen camera moments. So that is lovely. That was the main reason we did the slideshow, was so that it would hide all of the frozen camera moments. Lewis says, oh, I love the comparison of improv music. So being able to explore the zooming in mental space in relationship to the sense inputs allows for greater creativity, more choice. So here's what I was saying, Lewis, was, okay, two things. One is, there's always this question of where does creativity reside? What is the experience of creativity? Like, how do we have access to that? It's strange because at some point in the practice, and I think that this is something that anyone who practices quite a bit would notice, is that all of that creativity it's like everything becomes pregnant with that sort of creative, zhuzh, you could say. For me, if I were to look for where is the seat of creativity, that sort of spark, this has been my experience, and again, I don't want to say this is universal, but this has been my experience. There is the experience of deep, profound equanimity, of a deep acceptance of whatever's happening. No need to change anything of any kind whatsoever. And that can be very stable feeling. It can be very lovely. It can be very satisfying in a very non-exciting way. And so it's very, there's a kind of coolness to it. And just outside of that is intention. Because when you're in that place, you can't really intend, because nothing needs to change. So you could intend, but it starts to pull you out of that kind of equanimity. So right at that threshold, right between the area of total deep equanimity, we could talk about fourth jhana. I'm not a big jhana person, but just to give a little spatial sort of narrative. Fourth jhana, just between fourth jhana and third jhana, is this little tiny space, which is the world of intention. Now, we can intend a lot, but if we explore just intending the slightest little bit, that is dramatically transformational. And that, for me, is the seat of where creativity is. Now, what I was saying related to the improvisational music was that what's lovely for me is that I get to guide the same meditation 2 days in a row, which I'd be curious from folks who went to the retreat and were here today, how is it the same and how is it different? I'd be curious to see sort of what people's experience was there. Because for me, it was quite different. I got to explore and get into details that I hadn't been able to get into before, which Raquel and I, there's a little bit of a problem that Raquel and I talk about, where I was listening to a guided meditation that I did in 2019, and I was like, this is great. There's some great material here. What a great metaphor. And I'm like, I don't have access to that. I'm just working with whatever comes to mind at any point. So if this mind breaks down, which I'm certain it will, that's how that works. It's eventually, I'm going to lose a lot of this content. So we're talking about, like, how do you track that stuff? Like, how do you even know? Anyway, so that's what I was talking about. Bob says, this contemplation worked well for me today. Saturday was a dud, as I was on the mobile and the presentation view image was too small to work. That was not something we had planned around, was to tell people make sure you're on a desktop, but that's understandable. Totally understand. This has given me ideas for my own inquiries into seeing. First stop is my collection of gestalt perceptual puzzles. Lovely. With them, I could note gradations of meaning grasped as I puzzle the image. Yes, you can, and I want to give you a bigger palette of options to work from. So you can do that. And Bob, I can't remember. Are you currently in the Progress of Shinsight class? I can't remember. I don't know if they're named this way, but I basically have a lot of guided meditations that show us how to do it with any sense experience, but you can have fun with the Gestalt images. In that case, it's often a pretty complex layer of narrative. What we were doing in the retreat yesterday was watching the sort of one of the very rudimentary ways the mind produces narrative, which is just to produce space, to produce the sense of arrangement and, things being here, and noticing that the mind is tracking this material. As I close my eyes and move around, it tells me there's a microphone here and there's a monitor here and a camera there, and where things are, and the mind is constantly just tracking this. So watching the mind tracking this and watching the distortions that arise in that tracking is a really powerful way to tap into this organization of data that the mind does, this sort of very beautiful, elegant way that the mind is constantly working to keep our universe together. It's sort of like it's like a what is it called? Doctor Strange of that each person has inside, like using all of this magic and all of these powers to like just keep the world together. In that way, it's kind of very lovely. And watching that, honestly, it can seem like watching that is going to create more solidity, and the world is going to seem more solid if we watch the mind constantly creating solidity. But in the retreat we did yesterday, what can occur, and this is generally the case, is that it shows us all the other material. It shows us when it's not organized. It shows us when the material has come into order. But notice, whatever order, whatever narrative, whatever structure you're experiencing now of self and world and all these different narratives, notice that it replaced the one from the slideshow, or it replaced the one from yesterday. That's just a sort of little dot that we can sort of refer to and maybe look at some of the fuzzy details. But just the fact that it keeps replacing and keeps saying, no, this is totally solid, I swear it's totally solid, but also, let's get rid of that, and there's this new one. It starts to pull the curtain, pull the curtain off of this sort of, weird hologram that we call this solid sense of self and world and mind in this way. Let's see. Lewis says, that's a great pointer. Going from equanimity into the smallest possible intention, like the meta mind state practice. That is exactly, well, that's where I try to capture exactly that idea. So what Lewis is referring to is, I have this set of meditations, which I think, we have that. That's like available on our website. So if anyone wants that, that's available on our website. And if you're in the Progressive Shinsight class, you have access to that already. That's where we explore that explicitly. I've been thinking recently, and maybe Lewis and other people are interested, of re-recording those meditations with sort of a little bit more clarity, because I think that, I recorded those 2 or maybe even 3 years ago. Yeah, I think it was actually a while ago, and it was trying to, maybe it was even longer than that, but it was trying to produce a clear explanation of what I found a pretty convoluted or challenging explanation when I was in Burma, and they were teaching this sort of using metta meditation as an insight meditation. And that was the sort of, what they say was closer to what Mahasi taught, although, you never know. This was Mahasi's direct disciple, and he was saying this is much closer to what Mahasi taught. But again, I never trust those. I think it's possibly true. I have no reason to doubt that. Let's just say that. But I'm always a little skeptical of those kind of things. Bob says, not in the class. I get there are a range of venues. Yeah, of course, just have fun. Rory says, just for info, Saturday even failed. The slide presentation broke down. We're aware of that technical challenge. It was a number of people, depending on what platform you were using. It just totally didn't work. So thank you for bearing with us. Perceptual puzzles was just the first thought. Yeah, of course. And I'd be curious. I want to see some of those perceptual puzzles. It sounds great. In the retreat, I felt like I was being asked to track and find too many variables. Absolutely, makes perfect sense. Lewis says, the meta guidance is working well for me. Well, good. It works. That's good to know. But I have background in noting practice, so maybe that's why it's more intuitive. Well, I'm trying to cover a ton of ground in those particular guided meditations. And I think I have just a little bit smoother language now than I did at the time. I just instead of calling it a meta mind state, I just call it kind awareness. And it's a little bit easier to explain to people that we're just looking at the neutrality of awareness and then charging it as little as possible with that kind intention. May you be peaceful. And we're actually writing this line because you're saying, may you be peaceful. So we're referring to that equanimity when we're wishing this peace on whatever sensory experience is arising within us or we're sensing in the world. And that may you be peaceful is writing that exact line, because you notice there's a big emphasis on as little effort as possible. And so we ride that line, we're tapping into the piece that's just below that line. There's the, equanimity is down here, but we can't intend anything there. So we're tapping in and saying, may you be peaceful, drawing from that well, and then issuing that out as subtly as possible, noticing that if we do that, that really thin, subtle line of just intending as little as possible, as little effort as possible, starts to expand experientially. Like any object of meditation, the mind itself zooms into that on its own. It just sort of becomes bigger and bigger. And eventually that kind awareness permeates all of our experiencing. It sounds like metta. It feels like metta. It tastes like metta. Everything is permeated in this way. And so that's what I would refer to as the metta mind state. But again, we're thinking of changing that language, so maybe a new recording would be helpful. So folks, this is pretty much the most fun thing in the world, as per usual. But as would happen, life goes on and we have to pause today. However, we'll be back here in fewer than 48 hours for Wednesday's super fun class. I'm very excited about this. I'm thinking about maybe I'll make today's class, this class right here, a standalone video that people can watch if that's of interest. It's a pretty fun one. So please come back, join us in fewer than 48 hours. And what I have for you is a wish. My wish for you is that you're able right now in this particular moment just to soak into the momentum of all the previous moments. What's the momentum of all the previous moments? Why, that's our experience of this moment. All of the actions we've taken, all of the decisions we've made, all of the structural, physical, biological, evolutionary bits and pieces that have come to support and produce this particular experience now. This is the expression of the momentum of all of these narratives over time and space. So just to have contact with this at this particular moment, to allow the elegance, to allow the furtive, dark, dense soil of our perception to cultivate itself, to begin to connect with its own logic, its own mystery. Allowing ourselves to soak into the richness of experiencing. And letting that experience teach us, letting it be the great teacher. So my wish for you in the next 48 hours is that you have contact. And allow that contact to have impact. And in this way, impacting ourselves, and perhaps even impacting those around us in subtle, maybe even unperceptible ways, and letting that impact spread out to all the people who come in contact with all of those people onwards and onwards. In this way, simply enjoying the experience of being alive. Okay, folks, have a lovely day. Look forward to seeing everyone soon. Take care, everyone.